The muddy waters of Willow Creek surged around Abigail Hale's waist like grasping hands trying to drag her into the abyss. Her father's canvas satchel, heavy with survey documents that had already cost one life, pulled at her shoulder as she fought to keep footing on the treacherous stones beneath the raging current. Behind her, the thunder of pursuing hoofbeats mixed with the roar of spring snowmelt, creating a cacophony of terror that echoed off the canyon walls. "There, don't let her reach the other side." Bear Claw's voice boomed across the water as he spurred his horse down the steep bank. The massive hunter's buffalo coat made him look like some primordial beast emerging from nightmare, his rifle glinting in the harsh Dakota sunlight. Bullets whined past Abigail's head, with the angry buzz of hornets close enough that she could feel their passage disturb the air around her face. Sheriff Magnus Doyle sat his mount on the bank, his badge catching the light as he made no move to stop the violence unfolding before him. His cold calculation chilled her more than the icy water. This was law turned corrupt authority serving greed instead of justice. The memory of her father's broken body found at the bottom of these same cliffs 2 years ago flashed through her mind like lightning illuminating a storm-dark landscape. Peter Hale had been an honest surveyor, a man who believed maps should tell the truth regardless of who wanted them altered or buried. That integrity had killed him, and now his 20-year-old daughter faced the same choice between truth and survival. But as the current caught her heavy skirt and dragged her deeper into water that could crush her against the rocks or sweep her over the falls downstream, Abigail felt something she'd never experienced before. Not just fear, but a crystalline moment of understanding that this was her test. Not her father's test, not society's test of whether a young woman could survive the frontier, but her own personal crucible that would either forge her into someone worthy of Peter Hale's legacy or destroy her in the attempt. "Give us those papers, girl." Ronan Pike's shotgun boomed from upstream pellets, peppering the water around her like deadly hail. "Mr. Reddick just wants what's rightfully his." Nothing about this was rightful. And for the first time since arriving in Dakota territory, Abigail felt the full weight of what her father had died trying to prevent. The documents in her satchel proved Charles Reddick's plan to divert Willow Creek through his mining operation would flood the Lakota fishing grounds and destabilize the entire watershed. It wasn't just theft, it was ecological murder disguised as progress. Her arms burned from fighting the relentless current while clutching the precious evidence. Every instinct screamed at her to let go, to save herself, and let the papers sink into the muddy depths. But those documents were all that stood between Reddick and absolute control of the valley's water supply. More than that, they were her father's final gift to her, not just information, but the responsibility to finish what he'd started. That's when the paint horse splashed into the creek beside her with the grace of something born to this harsh land. The rider was Lakota, perhaps 25 years old, with the kind of steady presence that seemed to slow time itself around him. A hawk feather adorned his braided hair, and an old scar traced along his jaw. Not the romantic mark of some adventure story, but the real evidence of violence survived and lessons learned. What struck her most about his dark eyes wasn't their beauty, but their depths, like looking into still water that reflected more than it revealed. "Hold the horse's neck," he said simply, his voice cutting through chaos with quiet authority that brooked no argument. "Trust him to carry you safely." Tokala, she'd heard whispers of the name in town, always spoken with a mixture of respect and wariness. He guided his paint horse deeper into the treacherous current, with subtle shifts of weight, the animal moving with sure-footed confidence that spoke of perfect understanding between rider and mount. This wasn't rescue in the romantic sense, she realized. This was survival pure and practical. As another shot cracked from the bank, Tokala raised his rifle one-handed while controlling his horse with his knees. His return fire spoke with the precision of a man who'd learned that wasted ammunition meant death on the frontier. She watched Bear Claw curse and duck behind his mount as the bullet spanged off rock inches from his massive head. "Why are you helping me?" She gasped, water streaming from her hair. "Because some fights are worth joining," he replied, and something in his tone suggested this answer came from hard-earned experience rather than noble sentiment. They were nearing the far bank when disaster struck with the cruel timing that seemed to govern frontier life. The satchel's leather strap, worn thin by years of her father's fieldwork, chose that moment to part under the strain. Abigail lunged desperately for the bag as it bobbed in the churning foam, nearly losing her grip on Tokala's saddle in her desperation. "No." The word tore from her throat as she watched 2 years of her father's meticulous work disappear beneath the surface. Those surveys contained proof of the underground aquifer, that Reddick's diversion would destroy evidence that could save both the Lakota sacred sites and the town's future. Without them, she was just another woman, making accusations against a powerful man. Rage replaced despair as the current carried them toward a thick stand of cattail reeds. Her father had died for those papers, and now they rested at the bottom of the very creek they were meant to protect. But she was alive, and sometimes survival had to be enough for justice to find its way forward. The papers were gone, but the knowledge remained locked in her memory, imperfect perhaps, but real. Tokala guided his horse into the concealing reeds as shouts echoed from behind them. The thick stalks closed around them like a green curtain, muffling the voices of their pursuers, while his paint stood motionless in the shallows with the patience of an animal trained for this exact situation. They waited in tense silence as Bearclaw argued with Sheriff Doyle about following them into the marshland. Eventually, the sound of horses faded back toward town, but Abigail knew with bone-deep certainty that this was only the beginning. Reddick wouldn't abandon his scheme now, not when he was so close to controlling the entire valley's water supply. "All right, Doc. Your father's daughter." Tokala observed as they reached solid ground on the far side of the creek, studying her with those perceptive eyes. "You knew him. Peter Hale came to our camp many times over the past 2 years. He showed the elders his maps warned what would happen if the white mine owner succeeded in his plan." Tokala's expression darkened with something deeper than mere disapproval. "Your father spoke truth, even when truth brought danger. My people respected him for that rare quality. Much good it did him in the end. Truth has power that survives the speaker's death. You carry that power now, whether you feel ready for it or not." Abigail wrung muddy creek water from her torn dress, considering his words while studying this man who'd risked his own life to save hers. There was something in his manner that suggested personal investment beyond mere tribal politics, a controlled anger that spoke of losses she couldn't yet understand. "What happens now?" she asked, surprised by how much his answer mattered to her. "Now you choose your path. Run back east where it's safe, or stay and fight for what your father believed was worth dying for." The choice should have been obvious. She was a 20-year-old woman, alone on the frontier, facing men with guns, money, and legal authority. Every rational consideration argued for retreat, for accepting that some battles couldn't be won by the powerless against the corrupt. But looking at Tokala, seeing the calm certainty in his bearing, despite the dangers they both faced, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not love, that would be foolish romanticism, but recognition. Here was someone who understood that some principles were worth bleeding for, worth standing against impossible odds to defend. Her father had possessed that same quality, and it had gotten him killed. But it had also made his life matter in ways that mere survival never could. "I stay." She said the words emerging with strength that surprised her. "But I'll need help learning how to fight properly. You already know more than you think. Survival until now proves that." Thunder rumbled overhead, promising the kind of spring storm that could turn these plains into seas of impassable mud. They needed shelter allies and a plan that went beyond simple survival. But for the first time since arriving in Dakota territory 3 months ago, Abigail felt something more dangerous than hope kindling in her chest. She felt capable. Her father's work wasn't finished, and neither was she. as long as she lived and remembered what Peter Hale had taught her about integrity, justice, and standing up to bullies in expensive suits. Charles Reddick hadn't won his war for the valley's soul. The real fight was just beginning, and this time she intended to see it through to whatever end awaited. 2 months earlier, when February wind carved across the Dakota territory like a blade through bone, Charles Reddick had stood in his mine office, contemplating maps of an empire not yet built. The Copper Gulch operation extracted precious metal from the hillsides with profitable efficiency, but Reddick's vision extended far beyond simple mining into something grander and more permanent. Water was the key that would unlock everything. Control the water, and you controlled the land, the people, even the political future of the territory itself. Willow Creek flowed clear and strong from mountain snowpack, winding through Owl Canyon, where the Lakota had fished since before recorded memory, before emptying into the Missouri Basin's vast drainage system. It was perfect for his expanding needs if he could redirect its flow through his stamp mills while maintaining legal legitimacy. The surveyor's daughter arrives tomorrow on the weekly stage. Sheriff Magnus Doyle reported settling his lean frame into a chair across from Reddick's mahogany desk. Magnus was a useful investment, ambitious enough to be purchased, but intelligent enough to stay bought once the price was negotiated and paid. What intelligence do we have about her character and capabilities? Abigail Hale, 20 years old, educated back east in one of those finishing schools that teach ladies to read and think above their station. Lost her mother young to consumption, raised by her father after he moved out here for his health and surveying work. Peter taught her to handle firearms and horses' frontier necessities for survival. Reddick nodded thoughtfully, studying the detailed geological survey of Owl Canyon that had ultimately cost Peter Hale his life. The man had been thorough to a fault, perhaps too thorough for the comfort of those whose plans required certain geological facts to remain buried. His reports would have shown exactly what flooding the canyon would do to downstream communities, and they might reveal the underground aquifer system that made Reddick's scheme so potentially catastrophic and so potentially profitable. A young woman alone should be manageable with the right approach. Reddick mused, his fingers drumming against the leather-bound ledger that contained his most sensitive financial records. Offer her employment, perhaps a teaching position that keeps her occupied with harmless activities. Monitor her closely for any signs she understands what her father really discovered. And if she starts asking inconvenient questions about his death, then we provide satisfactory answers that discourage further inquiry. Accidents happen frequently on the frontier, Magnus. Everyone understands that reality. Reddick's smile held no warmth whatsoever. The important thing is maintaining public confidence in the official explanation, while ensuring she has no opportunity to examine contradictory evidence. What Reddick didn't mention to his corrupt sheriff was the deeper motivation driving his urgency. Eastern investors were growing impatient with his promises of expanded operations and increased profits. The territorial legislature was considering new regulations on mining water usage that could cripple his plans if implemented before his infrastructure was established. Most critically, railroad surveyors would arrive within 18 months to plan connections that would transform this isolated region into a vital transportation hub. The man who controlled water rights when that transformation occurred would control everything that followed: shipping, agriculture, town development, political appointments, even statehood itself. Reddick intended to be that man, regardless of how many obstacles required removal to achieve that goal. The next morning brought Abigail Hale to Willow Springs on the weekly stage, carrying little more than a battered carpet bag and the silver locket that held her father's photograph. The town appeared smaller and rougher than his letters had described, maybe 200 souls scattered among buildings that seemed hastily constructed by people too focused on survival to worry about permanence or beauty. Nora Keene waited outside the one-room schoolhouse, a practical woman approaching middle age whose offer of employment had provided Abigail both desperately needed income and something approaching purpose. After the humiliation back east, where businessman Cornelius Weatherby had attempted to trap her in a proxy marriage arrangement, a legal method that allowed men to force unwilling women into wedlock through financial manipulation. Abigail valued honest work above comfort or social standing. The children here are eager to learn when circumstances permit. Nora explained as they arranged Abigail's meager possessions in the cramped room above the school. Some from mining families, others from the scattered ranches. We occasionally receive Lakota children when their bands camp nearby, though recent tensions have made such visits increasingly rare. What sort of tensions? Abigail asked, noting how Nora's usually direct manner became evasive when discussing local politics. Charles Reddick's mining operation has been expanding aggressively. There are disputes over land boundaries, water usage rights, and grazing permits. Nothing openly violent yet, but the atmosphere grows more strained each week. People choose sides, whether they want to or not. That evening, Abigail walked Willow Springs' dusty main street with growing unease, sensing undercurrents she couldn't identify but couldn't ignore. The town felt fractured in ways that went beyond typical frontier roughness. Miners finishing their shifts avoided eye contact with ranchers in town for supplies. The few Lakota traders who'd set up temporary camps outside town conducted their business with obvious haste, as if eager to complete transactions and leave before trouble found them. The confrontation that would define her future began innocuously enough when 3 Lakota men approached the general store, carrying carefully prepared bison robes to trade 2 younger warriors, flanking an older man, whose bearing suggested leadership and hard-won wisdom. They moved with quiet confidence, despite being outnumbered, comfortable in their own authority, but alert to potential threats. Ronan Pike emerged from the Rattlesnake Saloon specifically to intercept them, his massive frame blocking their path with deliberate intimidation. He was Charles Reddick's primary enforcer, employed for situations requiring violence rather than negotiation, and his yellowed teeth and eager hands suggested he enjoyed his work. "Stores closed to your kind today," he announced loudly enough for half the street to hear his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "Come back tomorrow when you've learned proper manners for civilized company." The older Lakota Tokala, as Abigail would soon learn, studied Pike with eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts. "The sun has not set. The store remains open for legitimate trade. Not for you, it doesn't, Blanket Man." A crowd was forming with the inevitable magnetism of potential violence drawn by the promise of entertainment or bloodshed. Abigail recognized the hungry anticipation in their faces, the desire for conflict that seemed to infect frontier towns like a chronic disease. She'd witnessed similar expressions back east, though never directed at her personally. But standing there watching this deliberate humiliation unfold, something unexpected stirred in her chest. Not romantic attraction to the handsome Lakota warrior that would be both inappropriate and dangerous. Instead, she felt recognition of something her father had tried to teach her about human dignity, and the courage required to defend it when defense carried personal cost. Mr. Pike," she said, stepping forward with her chin raised despite her racing pulse. "I believe these gentlemen were here first." Pike's attention swiveled toward her like a gun barrel seeking a target, his small eyes narrowing as he assessed this unexpected interference. "This ain't your concern, schoolmarm. Best stick to teaching children their letters and leave men's business to men who understand it, where fair dealing is everyone's concern in a civilized community." She replied, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "These men have every right to trade here without harassment." Something passed between her and Tokala in that charged moment, not the instant attraction of romantic fiction, but something more valuable and rare. Recognition between 2 people who understood what it meant to stand alone against pressure to choose principle over safety when the choice carried genuine consequences. "The lady speaks wisdom," Tokala said simply, his voice carrying across the tension-filled street. Pike's face reddened with embarrassment and mounting rage made worse by the crowd's obvious interest in this development. "Don't you tell me about wisdom, you savage—" He never completed the slur. Takala moved like flowing water, stepping close enough that Pike had to crane his neck to maintain eye contact. The motion appeared casual, almost lazy, but it carried an unmistakable promise of consequences if the wrong words were spoken or the wrong actions taken. Ikarj, choose your next words with greater care. Takala suggested in that same calm tone, though something dangerous flickered in his dark eyes. The entire street seemed to hold its collective breath. Then Pike spat in the dust and stepped aside with obvious reluctance, muttering curses under his breath, as the Lakota men entered the store to conduct their business with quiet dignity. But Abigail noticed several important details that others missed. How Takala's gaze swept the crowd methodically before he mounted his paint horse, cataloging faces and positions, like a man accustomed to being outnumbered and attacked. She observed Dr. Edwin Harper, watching from his clinic doorway with obvious approval, while Henry Pike Ronan's younger brother shook his head in visible disgust at his sibling's behavior. Most significantly, she saw how Takala's eyes found hers once more, before he rode away, holding her gaze just long enough to acknowledge what had passed between them. That night, lying on her narrow cot above the schoolhouse, Abigail stared at the rough ceiling while trying to understand what she'd witnessed and participated in. Willow Springs wasn't just another frontier town, struggling with the usual problems of isolation and hardship. There were deeper forces at work here, dangerous currents of conflict and corruption that had already claimed her father's life. She pulled his locket from beneath her nightdress, studying his photograph by candlelight, while making a silent promise. Peter Hale had been a good man who tried to do right by everyone he encountered regardless of their race or social position. That integrity had killed him, but it had also made his life matter in ways that simple survival never could. Now his daughter faced the same choice he'd confronted: stand up for what was right, despite personal cost, or keep her head down and hope safety could be found in invisibility and compliance. The choice, she realized, had already been made the moment she'd stepped forward to defend 3 strangers against injustice. There was no going back to ignorance or innocence now. In the parlor above the Rattlesnake Saloon that served as his informal headquarters, Charles Reddick was conducting very different business with Sheriff Magnus Doyle. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows across maps and ledgers spread between them like battle plans, which in many ways they were. The girl interfered with Ronan's work today. Magnus reported helping himself to whiskey from Reddick's private bottle. Sided with the Lakota traders against him in full view of half the town. That demonstrates either admirable courage or dangerous foolishness. Both qualities can prove troublesome if not properly managed. Reddick studied his most detailed survey of Owl Canyon, envisioning the changes that would reshape the entire valley according to his vision. What's your assessment of her character and potential threat level? Educated independent, taught to handle firearms by her father. No husband or male relatives to influence her decisions or control her actions. That makes her fundamentally unpredictable. Magnus paused to sip his drink. She's also been asking questions about Peter's death, subtle inquiries, but persistent ones. Reddick felt a familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied potential complications to his carefully laid plans. Predictable people were useful tools. Unpredictable ones were dangerous variables that could destabilize everything. And Peter Hale's daughter would have inherited more than his survey techniques. She'd have his inconvenient moral compass as well. Increase surveillance on her activities immediately. If she starts investigating circumstances surrounding her father's death or asking specific questions about water rights and geological surveys, I'll handle the situation with appropriate discretion. See that you do, Magnus. The territorial judge won't approve our diversion permits without proper documentation, and those geological surveys represent the cornerstone of legitimizing everything we've planned. The mine expansion, stamp mill construction, control of the entire basin's water supply, all of it depends on redirecting that creek through legal channels. What Reddick didn't share with his bought sheriff was the full scope of his ambitions. The water diversion was merely the first step in a much larger scheme that would establish him as the unquestioned power in this region when statehood arrived. Railroad connections, agricultural development town, planning, territorial appointments, the man who controlled water would control everything that followed. Outside February, wind howled across the prairie with the promise of spring floods that would swell Willow Creek into a torrential force capable of powering his expanding operations. Perfect conditions for an accident that would permanently reshape the valley's water flow according to his specifications if such an accident were engineered by someone clever enough to make it appear natural. Reddick rolled up his maps with deep satisfaction, already envisioning the empire he would build on this foundation of stolen water and buried truth. Everything was proceeding exactly according to his carefully constructed timeline. The fire started just past midnight on a Tuesday, when most of Willow Springs lay sleeping beneath its protective blanket of late winter snow. Abigail woke to the acrid smell of smoke and urgent shouting from the street below her father's survival training, immediately taking control as she grabbed his Colt revolver from beneath her narrow mattress. The trading post was already fully engulfed when she reached the chaotic street flames licking hungrily at wooden walls with unnatural intensity fed by kerosene that had been accidentally spilled from several sources. But Abigail's sharp eyes caught details. Others missed scorch patterns that spoke of deliberate ignition, the convenient absence of Sheriff Magnus and his deputies, the organized way certain men moved through the crowd, while others fought the fire with genuine desperation. The children. Nora Keene appeared at her side through the smoke, pointing toward the schoolhouse, where telltale wisps were already seeping under doors and around window frames. 3 of them stayed late for extra arithmetic lessons. They ran together through the pandemonium of bucket brigades and scattered livestock, past women gathering precious belongings and men shouting conflicting orders in the orange-painted darkness. Dr. Edwin Harper had reached the school ahead of them, shepherding frightened children out the back entrance, while Henry Pike beat methodically at sparks that threatened to spread the conflagration to every wooden structure in town. "That's everyone accounted for," Harper called his ever-present medical bag slung across his shoulder. "The building's structurally clear." But Abigail barely registered his words, because through the smoke and confusion, she'd spotted something that made her blood run cold with understanding. Ronan Pike's distinctive wagon was pulling up near the burning trading post with suspicious timing, and the man himself was climbing down with movements that had nothing to do with firefighting and everything to do with opportunity created by chaos. "Miss Hale." His voice cut through the noise as he approached his massive frame, seeming even more threatening in the dancing firelight. "Terrible tragedy, this unfortunate accident. Good thing I happened to be passing by when help was needed most urgently." She backed instinctively toward the schoolhouse, her hand moving without conscious thought toward the concealed weapon her father had taught her to carry and use. Something in Pike's manner triggered every warning Peter Hale had drilled into her consciousness during their long frontier apprenticeship. The man's eyes held too much focus, too much satisfaction for someone who'd simply stumbled across disaster. "Mr. Reddick sent me personally to ensure your complete safety during this dangerous situation." Pike continued closing the distance between them with predatory patience. "Hazardous night for a young lady to be wandering unprotected. Why don't you come with me until circumstances settle down? I'm perfectly safe here among friends and neighbors, thank you." "I'm afraid that's no longer your decision to make, schoolmarm." Pike's hand shot out like a striking snake to grab her arm. But Abigail was ready for the attack, her father's training overriding panic as she twisted away from his grip while drawing Peter Hale's well-maintained pistol. But Pike had anticipated resistance and brought his other hand up to catch her wrist, applying crushing pressure designed to force her fingers to release their grip on salvation. The struggle that followed was brief but vicious, conducted in deadly silence, while the town's attention remained focused on the spreading fire. Pike was stronger and more experienced in violence, but Abigail had desperation and intelligence on her side. When he tried to drag her bodily toward his waiting wagon, she sank her teeth deep into his thumb, tasting blood and dirt as he roared with pain and momentary distraction. That's when something large and powerful slammed into Pike from his blind side, sending them both stumbling apart in opposite directions through the smoke-filled chaos. A mule, she realized with shocked gratitude. Someone had deliberately rammed Pike, with one of the sturdy animals from the livery stable buying her precious seconds to recover her balance and weapon, while Pike struggled to regain his footing in the muddy snow. Tokala slid from the mule's broad back, with fluid grace, moving to position himself between Abigail and her attacker. Despite the fresh blood showing on his shirt, where flying debris from the burning buildings had torn through fabric and flesh. His presence seemed to create a pocket of deadly calm amid the surrounding pandemonium, like the eye of a hurricane where violence waited to be unleashed. "The lady declined your generous invitation," he observed in that same steady voice that had cut through gunfire and rushing water during their first meeting. Pike drew his skinning knife, wiping blood from his bitten thumb, while his eyes glittered with anticipated violence. "This ain't your fight, blanket man. Walk away now while you still have working legs to carry you. It became my fight the moment you put hands on her without permission." They began circling each other in the hellish firelight, while Abigail kept her father's pistol trained on Pike's center mass, ready to shoot if the blade got past Tokala's guard. Around them, the desperate work of fighting the spreading fire continued. But she noticed with growing alarm that Sheriff Magnus remained conspicuously absent from the scene, exactly as she would have expected if this chaos had been deliberately orchestrated. Pike lunged with his knife in a clumsy overhand strike that telegraphed his intentions. Tokala caught the descending wrist twisted with precise leverage and sent the blade spinning away into darkness. A brief but brutal exchange of punches followed, ending when Pike found himself face down in muddy slush with Tokala's knee pressed firmly between his shoulder blades. "Leave this place immediately," Tokala said with quiet menace. "Before I forget the restraint my elders taught me to show toward foolish children." Pike struggled briefly against the iron grip, then went limp in submission. When Tokala released him, the man scrambled to his feet and retreated toward his wagon, nursing his injured hand, while muttering threats about unfinished business and future reckonings. "You need to go now," Tokala told Abigail. As the sound of approaching horses became audible through the fire's roar, too many riders moving with too much coordination to be coincidental. "More of Reddick's men are coming, and they won't be interested in conversation or negotiation." She could see them materializing through the smoke, like phantoms armed riders spreading out to surround the burning town center. This hadn't been a random accident, followed by opportunistic kidnapping, but a carefully orchestrated operation designed to create chaos while eliminating the one person who might expose Reddick's water theft scheme. "What about you?" she asked, surprised by how much his answer mattered to her survival. Not just physical survival, but the preservation of something inside herself that she was only beginning to understand. "I follow when the path is clear. My horse knows the way to safety." There wasn't time for longer conversation or detailed planning. Abigail grabbed her carpet bag from the threatened schoolhouse and ran toward the Cottonwood Flats, where she knew the Lakota band maintained their winter camp, leaving behind any pretense of normal life or peaceful resolution. Behind her, orange flames painted the night sky, while the sound of systematic pursuit grew steadily closer. She'd lost her teaching position, her shelter, her place in the white community social structure. But she was alive and free, carrying in her memory the knowledge her father had died to preserve, knowledge that might yet prevent Reddick from stealing an entire watershed for his mining empire. The Lakota camp materialized from darkness, like something conjured from half-remembered dreams. Buffalo hide teepees stood in a protective circle around a central fire, their painted surfaces glowing softly with reflected starlight, while dogs announced her arrival with low warning growls. The encampment felt ancient and permanent, despite its temporary nature, connected to this land in ways the white settlements could never achieve. Tokala appeared from the shadows, leading his paint horse, gesturing for absolute silence as voices carried from the direction of town. His people emerged from their lodges, with the quiet efficiency of those accustomed to sudden danger, but their expressions showed wariness toward this white woman who'd brought trouble to their peaceful winter refuge. "Well, you are injured," Tokala said, noticing blood on her torn dress and the way she favored her left wrist where Pike had tried to break her grip. "Just scratches and bruises. You're the one who needs proper medical attention." Dr. Harper had provided her with basic medical supplies, along with instruction in their use. Frontier teachers needed such knowledge to survive the isolation and frequent accidents of territorial life. She cleaned Tokala's shoulder wound with whiskey from his own supply, then bandaged the injury with strips carefully torn from her cotton petticoat, working by firelight, while the entire camp watched this unprecedented interaction. "Your people don't trust me," she observed, noting the careful distance maintained by the tribal elders and the way mothers kept children close to their sides. Trust must be earned through consistent actions over time, not granted because of good intentions or temporary cooperation. "You stood against Pike when remaining silent would have been safer. You tend wounds without being asked or obligated. These represent promising beginning steps. My father believed your people had every right to fish Owl Canyon without interference from white miners or territorial authorities. Charles Reddick disagreed strongly enough to commit murder over the principle." Tokala's expression didn't change, but she sensed his attention sharpening like a blade being honed for use. "You speak of deliberate killing as established fact rather than mere suspicion. Operateurs, what else would you call it? My father discovered geological evidence that Reddick's water diversion would cause catastrophic flooding throughout this entire valley. 3 days later, he was found dead at the bottom of the canyon cliffs, with a whiskey bottle planted nearby to suggest accidental death from drunkenness. But you reject this official explanation completely. My father never drank to excess under any circumstances, and he knew those cliff paths better than any man alive. Someone pushed him to his death, then carefully arranged the scene to prevent investigation." Abigail met Tokala's penetrating gaze, directly seeing something there that might have been shared loss. "The question is whether anyone else cares enough about justice to help me prove what really happened. Justice requires evidence that will convince white authorities, not just moral certainty or righteous anger. Then we find that evidence, whatever the cost or danger involved." Tokala studied her face for a long moment, as if measuring her resolve against challenges she couldn't yet imagine. Then he provided buffalo robes and a place near the central fire, settling himself outside the teepee, with his rifle across his knees, in a position that commanded the entire approaches to their camp. For the first time since her father's death, Abigail slept deeply without the nightmares that had plagued her for months. Dreams of grasping hands and forced marriages, of isolation and powerlessness in a world that seemed designed to crush anyone who stood alone against corruption. Tokala's vigilant presence allowed her to rest completely, not because she depended on his protection, but because she was no longer facing the darkness alone. But even in sleep, part of her mind was already planning. The papers were lost, but the knowledge remained locked in her memory. Reddick thought he'd eliminated the threat to his scheme, but he'd only made her more determined to see justice done, whatever form that justice ultimately took. The wanted for arson posters appeared throughout Willow Springs like an infestation of lies, nailed to every post and building, where citizens might see Tokala's face staring out from crude sketches. "Dangerous fugitive," proclaimed the bold letters beneath, offering $50 reward for information leading to capture enough money to tempt desperate men into betraying basic human decency. Sheriff Magnus Doyle assembled his posse at dawn, with the enthusiasm of a man finally given license to pursue personal vendettas under color of law. His recruits included drifters passing through town, indebted ranch hands facing foreclosure, and anyone else willing to ride for the promise of easy money and legal protection for whatever methods they chose to employ in pursuit of their quarry. Bearclaw volunteered immediately, his massive frame straining the leather of his gun belt as he checked weapons and filled ammunition pouches with methodical precision. The bounty hunter's buffalo coat made him look like some prehistoric predator, and his eager grin suggested he viewed this hunt as entertainment rather than law enforcement. In the Lakota camp, tribal elders gathered in solemn council to debate their response to this escalating threat against their adopted member. Gray Wolf, weathered leader of the band, listened carefully to arguments from both sides before speaking in the measured tones of hard-won wisdom. Some voices demanded that Tokala leave immediately, taking this white woman's troubles with him to protect the band from inevitable retaliation. Others called for war, insisting that Lakota warriors shouldn't be hunted like animals by corrupt white lawmen without facing organized resistance. Tokala heard both arguments with respectful attention before responding in his native language for several minutes, his words carrying the weight of practical experience rather than youthful bravado. Abigail caught fragments terms for water, winter, and children, but the concern in his voice transcended linguistic barriers. "What did you tell them?" she asked when the council dispersed with obvious reluctance. "That we have insufficient food stored for a prolonged siege, and the river remains frozen solid, preventing fishing or easy travel. Fighting now would mean starvation before spring planting becomes possible." He studied dust clouds marking the posse's movement across distant plains like a general calculating enemy strength. But patience has definite limits that grow shorter with each provocation. The first direct confrontation came when they were checking rabbit snares that Shyla had set near Quicksilver Creek, moving carefully through terrain that offered both concealment and multiple escape routes should pursuit materialize. Bearclaw had positioned himself on the bluff overlooking the primary creek, crossing hidden among weathered boulders with a braided lariat coiled in his massive hands. The rope dropped like a striking serpent aimed directly at Tokala's throat with the precision of long practice. Only his horse's superior training saved him from immediate death. The paint sensed danger and shied sideways at the crucial moment, causing the noose to catch his shoulder instead of his neck. Bearclaw yanked hard, trying to drag him from the saddle onto the rocks below, where finishing the job would be simple. Tokala drew his knife and severed the rope in one fluid motion, then spurred his mount up the treacherous bank toward his attacker with controlled fury. Bearclaw was already scrambling across the boulder field with surprising agility for such a massive man, but Tokala's horse was bred specifically for this unforgiving terrain. They met on a narrow ledge with knife against rifle stock, neither man giving ground, despite the deadly drop yawning behind them. The struggle was brief but savage ending, when Bearclaw lost his footing and tumbled into the abyss with a scream that echoed off canyon walls before cutting off abruptly, one less hunter to worry about. Tokala observed grimly blood seeping through his shirt where the rope had burned skin. But his eyes held no satisfaction, only the weary recognition of necessary violence in an unjust world. That evening brought a different kind of assault to Willow Springs itself, when Reddick's men raided the schoolhouse under the pretense of searching for evidence related to the arson investigation. They claimed to possess warrants for examining educational materials. But when Nora Keene demanded to inspect their authority, they produced only hastily scrawled notes without official seals or territorial signatures. These are private educational documents belonging to the territorial school system, she declared, firmly blocking the doorway with her small frame, while drawing on reserves of courage that impressed even herself. "You have absolutely no legal authority here. Stand aside, lady." The lead searcher growled, shoving past her roughly enough to send her stumbling into a desk, with force that left bruises. "We know exactly what we're looking for and where to find it." Dr. Edwin Harper arrived as they were systematically destroying the schoolhouse interior, dumping books onto the floor and overturning furniture in their search for Peter Hale's missing geological surveys. His medical bag hung at his side as always, but his hand rested meaningfully on the pistol concealed beneath his coat, a reminder that frontier physicians learned to defend themselves and their patients against all threats. "Gentlemen," he said in the steady voice he used with difficult patients and dangerous drunks, "I strongly suggest you conduct your search with more respect for private property and civic order. This is official territorial business, Doc. Stay out of it if you know what's good for your health. Without proper warrants bearing legitimate seals, this constitutes trespassing and destruction of public property. I'll be delighted to testify to that effect before any honest court in the territory." One searcher, a thick-set miner named Garrett, who owed money to everyone in town, stepped close to Harper with fists raised in obvious threat. "Maybe you need some medical attention yourself, old man. I'd be happy to provide it free of charge." The fight that followed was brief, but decisive in its outcome. Garrett swung first with a haymaker that would have dropped most men Harper's age, but the doctor had learned to defend himself during years of patching up violent miners and volatile cowboys. He ducked the wild punch and came up with a slate blackboard in his hands, catching Garrett across the temple with a sharp crack that echoed through the building. The other searchers retreated hastily toward the door, suddenly less enthusiastic about violence, when faced with real resistance instead of easy intimidation. But the damage was complete. The schoolhouse lay in ruins, books scattered and furniture broken beyond repair. More significantly, the town was now clearly divided between those supporting Reddick's expansion and those brave enough to oppose it openly. That night in the Lakota camp, Abigail sat beside Tokala as he cleaned and maintained his rifle with the methodical precision of a craftsman caring for essential tools. The routine seemed almost meditative in its careful attention to detail, and she found herself studying the controlled movements of his scarred hands. "You're aggravating that shoulder wound unnecessarily," she observed with growing concern. "It will heal properly given sufficient time and rest." "Not if you keep fighting before it has a chance to mend. You're risking permanent injury." He looked directly at her, then firelight reflecting in dark eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed about his thoughts. "You worry about my welfare and safety." It wasn't quite a question, but it carried the weight of one. Abigail considered her response, carefully aware that honesty was becoming a dangerous habit between them in ways that extended beyond mere survival tactics. "You've helped me twice now when walking away would have been easier and safer. That creates certain obligations and responsibilities." Obligations. He tested the word thoughtfully, as if examining it for hidden meanings. "Is that what you believe exists between us? What else could it be?" But even as she asked the question, Abigail knew the answer was far more complicated than simple duty or gratitude could explain. Tokala represented something she'd never encountered in her 20 years of careful living strength, without brutality protection, without possession respect, without condescension. The men back east who'd pursued her had wanted to own her completely, to add her to their collections of assets like livestock or valuable property. Tokala simply stood beside her when standing was needed most. "You owe me nothing whatsoever," he said finally, setting aside his cleaned weapon with deliberate care. "I want only absolute truth between us, nothing more, and certainly nothing less than complete honesty." Truth, such a deceptively simple concept, yet it carried enormous weight in this place, where deception and corruption ruled through fear and intimidation. Abigail found herself nodding acceptance of the compact he offered, recognizing it as something rare and precious. "Then honestly, I'm grateful beyond words for your help and protection. And I feel genuinely safe when you're nearby, which is something I haven't experienced since my father's death." What do you fear most in this situation? Being completely alone again, having no one who understands why this fight matters enough to risk everything for justice. That night, for the first time since childhood, Abigail slept deeply without waking in terror from dreams of forced marriage and grasping hands that sought to claim her against her will. Tokala's presence beyond the teepee wall, alert and protective, but never intrusive or demanding, allowed her mind to rest completely. Outside their shelter, Dakota wind carried the scent of approaching snow, and the distant howl of wolves calling to their pack across the moonlit wilderness. But within the circle of firelight and painted buffalo hide, she felt secure enough to dream of possibilities instead of surrendering to nightmares born of past helplessness. Dr. Edwin Harper's methodical plan for gathering evidence emerged from his conviction that only documented proof would convince territorial authorities to act against Charles Reddick's systematic corruption. As he explained to their unlikely alliance during a pre-dawn meeting in his clinic, accusations without legal foundation were worthless against a man with Reddick's extensive political connections and financial resources. We require 3 distinct categories of evidence, Harper said, spreading a hand-drawn map across his examination table while checking the door for potential eavesdroppers. First, proof of illegal water contamination from the mining operation. Second, documentation of Reddick's plan to divert Willow Creek through his facilities. Third, and most importantly, direct evidence connecting him to Peter Hale's murder. Henry Pike nodded grimly from his position near the window, where he could monitor the street for approaching threats. The rancher had lost 2 more calves to something toxic in the creek water, and his remaining cattle now refused to drink from their traditional sources, animal instinct recognizing what human analysis had yet to prove definitively. I can help document the poisoning effects, Henry offered with obvious reluctance to involve himself in what amounted to rebellion against established authority. But we'll need scientific analysis to prove what specific contaminants are causing the deaths. My colleague, Professor Williams at the Territorial College, possesses equipment for testing water samples. Harper replied, gathering glass bottles and labels from his medical supplies with practiced efficiency. If we can collect samples from multiple points along the creek, both upstream and downstream from the mine discharge, he can identify exact contaminants and concentrations that will stand up in court. Abigail thought painfully of her father's survey papers resting somewhere at the bottom of Willow Creek, containing geological proof that could have ended this conflict quickly and decisively. Without those reports, we can't prove what diverting the water will do to the underground aquifer systems. There might be duplicate copies filed with territorial offices in Bismarck, Nora suggested hopefully. Survey work is usually documented in multiple locations for legal protection and reference purposes. That would require weeks of correspondence with officials we have no reason to trust, Tokala pointed out with characteristic practicality, and assumes those copies haven't already been destroyed or conveniently altered to support Reddick's applications. Dr. Harper was already moving with purpose, filling containers with scientific precision, while his mind calculated logistics and timing. Then we work with evidence we can obtain ourselves through direct action. Henry, show us where your cattle died. I want those water samples collected while any traces remain chemically detectable. The expedition to Henry Pike's ranch revealed the comprehensive scope of environmental damage that Reddick's operation was inflicting on the entire valley ecosystem. The modest spread occupied a natural meadow 3 miles south of town, where Willow Creek should have provided clean water for livestock and irrigation throughout the growing season. Instead, the grass grew sickly and sparse near the contaminated stream, and the very air seemed to carry an unhealthy metallic taste. Henry led them to a pen containing 2 young calves, their bodies rigid with rigor mortis and eyes clouded by whatever toxins had killed them during their final agonizing hours. Found them yesterday morning lying exactly like this. The surviving animals won't go anywhere near the creek anymore. They know instinctively when water means death instead of life. Dr. Harper knelt beside the nearest carcass, examining mouth and eyes with clinical thoroughness born of years treating mysterious illnesses on the frontier. Classic symptoms of heavy metal poisoning, most likely mercury compounds, possibly arsenic derivatives from ore processing chemicals. He methodically filled bottles with creek water, labeling each container with precise date, time, and location coordinates. Professor Williams should be able to identify exact contaminants and provide concentrations that will convince even skeptical judges. How long before we receive definitive results? Abigail asked, understanding that time was becoming their most precious and rapidly diminishing resource. 3 weeks minimum, assuming favorable weather, allows the post rider to reach Bismarck without delays. Could be significantly longer if spring storms make the roads completely impassable for extended periods. While Harper collected his scientific samples with meticulous care, Takala walked the creek bank with the focused attention of a hunter reading complex animal sign that revealed hidden stories. Near a bend where mining runoff created an oily sheen on the water's surface that reflected rainbow colors in the sunlight, he discovered something that made him summon the others with urgent gestures. "Someone has been here recently," he announced, indicating boot prints preserved in dried mud that had escaped recent rain. Heavy man walking directly from the direction of the mine. He remained in this exact spot for considerable time, performing some task that required kneeling repeatedly. Henry examined the distinctive tracks more closely, his expression growing dark with recognition and family shame. "That's Ronan's boot pattern, has a characteristic nail repair, where he stepped on something sharp last month while shoeing horses. But what was my brother doing out here alone?" Their answer lay concealed beneath a pile of stones, carefully arranged to appear entirely natural to casual observation. Wrapped in oiled canvas to protect contents from moisture and animal interference. They discovered a leather-bound ledger filled with dates, names, and financial amounts that told a story of comprehensive corruption extending far beyond simple mining operations. Most entries recorded routine business expenses and employee wages, but several pages near the back contained information that made Abigail's pulse quicken with excitement and growing understanding of Reddick's true scope. Regular payments to Bearclaw for undefined security services. She read aloud with mounting anger. Substantial bribes to Sheriff Magnus for maintaining public order and cooperation. Large expenditures for black powder and fusing materials charged to something called Special Infrastructure Projects. Transport fees for heavy equipment delivery to Owl Canyon. She looked up at the others with dawning comprehension. This documents the entire criminal conspiracy in Reddick's own handwriting, including clear evidence of bribery, planned destruction of natural resources, and conspiracy to commit massive fraud. Harper added grimly, understanding the legal implications. "If we can present this to an honest territorial judge, first we need to reach Bismarck alive with our evidence intact." Henry interrupted, scanning the horizon nervously for signs of approaching trouble. "Reddick won't allow this information to survive if he discovers we possess it." Their conversation was cut short by the appearance of dust clouds approaching from the direction of town. Too organized and purposeful to represent wild horses, too numerous to indicate casual travelers. Magnus Doyle's expanded posse was moving again, with obvious determination. And this time, they seemed to know exactly where to conduct their search. "How many riders can you count?" Abigail asked, checking her father's pistol while her heart began racing with familiar dread. 8, possibly 10 armed men. Takala replied after studying the distant figures through the heat shimmer. "Far too many for direct confrontation in completely open terrain like this." They abandoned their horses and sought cover in a shallow draw that cut across the prairie like an ancient wound carved by long-vanished water. The depression provided barely 4 feet of concealment, but it represented their only available shelter for miles in any direction across this exposed landscape. Abigail found herself pressed between Henry Pike and Takala, acutely aware of her racing heartbeat as the sound of hoofbeats grew steadily closer. The pursuit passed within 50 yards of their hiding place, close enough that she could hear Magnus Doyle giving specific orders for systematic searching of the surrounding area. They lay motionless for what felt like hours, as the posse quartered the ground around them methodically, sometimes approaching so near that dust from horses' hooves drifted down into their shallow refuge while they held their breath and prayed for invisibility. Henry started to raise his head for better observation of enemy movements. but Tokala's firm hand pressed him back down just as a rifle cracked somewhere in the distance. The bullet whined overhead, with lethal intent followed immediately by triumphant shouts of discovery. For they're in the draw, don't let any of them escape alive. The gunfight that followed tested every survival skill Abigail had absorbed from her father's careful instruction over the years. She found herself reloading her pistol with hands that trembled, only slightly, muscle memory taking control, while her conscious mind focused entirely on target selection and ammunition conservation. She aimed carefully for the center mass of a rider attempting to flank their position and squeezed the trigger with deliberate precision, feeling the weapon buck against her palm. The man toppled from his saddle with a cry of pain, whether wounded or killed, she couldn't determine, and didn't have time to verify. But her shot bought precious seconds for movement toward better cover among scattered boulders. A rifle bullet from the rim above took Tokala in the ribs, a grazing wound that drew blood, but didn't penetrate deeply enough to cause immediate incapacitation. Abigail pressed her scarf against the bleeding, while Henry Pike sent return fire that clipped their attacker's shoulder and drove him back from the exposed edge. "We can't maintain this position," Tokala said through gritted teeth, pain evident in his voice, but determination unshaken. "They'll surround us completely within minutes. The horses are too distant to reach safely," Henry pointed out with obvious frustration. "Then we follow the creek bed on foot. Water provides cover they can't ride through easily, and the path leads back toward town through terrain that favors defenders over attackers." It represented their only viable option for survival. One by one, they slipped from the draw into the shallow depression marking Willow Creek's path across the grassland. The water was ankle-deep here, but the eroded banks offered concealment, as long as they remained crouched below the natural sight line. They'd covered perhaps half the distance to town when pursuit caught up again with relentless determination. This time, there was no cover except the creek itself, forcing them to wade into deeper water while bullets kicked up spray around them like deadly rain. Abigail's dress soaked through immediately, the heavy fabric dragging at her movements, but she kept the precious ledger held high above the current that threatened to claim this evidence as it had claimed her father's surveys. By the time they reached Willow Springs' outskirts, 3 members of the posse had abandoned the chase, and the remaining riders seemed content to let them escape rather than follow into town where witnesses might complicate their official story. But the message was unmistakably clear. Reddick now knew they possessed damaging evidence, and he was fully prepared to commit multiple murders rather than allow it to reach territorial authorities. In Dr. Harper's clinic, as he cleaned wounds and assessed damage with professional competence, the full reality of their situation crystallized with frightening clarity. They were no longer simply investigating Reddick's crimes or gathering evidence for legal proceedings. They were at open war with forces that controlled local law enforcement and maintained political connections reaching directly to territorial capitals. "We need to transport this information to honest officials immediately," Harper declared while bandaging Tokala's ribs with methodical care. "But Reddick's people will be monitoring all the obvious routes and conventional transportation methods." "Not all routes," Tokala replied thoughtfully, wincing as the tight bandage pulled against torn skin. "There are paths through the Badlands that white settlers have never discovered or mapped. My cousin Shyla has used them many times for long-distance trading expeditions. Can he be trusted with evidence this crucial to everyone's survival?" Their strategic discussion was interrupted by soft, careful knocking on the clinic's rear entrance. Nora Keene stepped inside with obvious nervousness, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain and exhaustion from recent events. "I've been thinking extensively about Peter Hale's papers," she said without preamble, her voice tight with suppressed excitement. "There might be something critically important that you overlooked during your initial search." She led them through darkened streets to the schoolhouse, where debris from the previous day's systematic ransacking still littered the floor like broken dreams and shattered hopes. But Nora ignored the obvious destruction, going instead directly to a storage chest in the corner that had been overlooked during the searchers' focus on more obvious hiding places. Your father kept certain personal effects here while conducting his geological work in this area, she explained to Abigail, carefully lifting out bundles wrapped in protective cloth. Official surveys were filed with territorial offices according to legal requirements. But he maintained private copies of field notes and preliminary sketches for his own reference and continued analysis. Inside the chest, protected by layers of oiled leather and treated canvas, they discovered a comprehensive portfolio containing dozens of hand-drawn maps and detailed geological observations. Most showed routine elevation markings and soil composition data. But one particular chart made Abigail gasp with recognition and sudden understanding of why her father had been murdered. The complete underground aquifer system, she whispered, tracing her father's meticulous annotations with trembling fingers that recognized his distinctive handwriting. Running directly beneath Owl Canyon and extending throughout the entire valley drainage system. The implications were staggering in their scope and potential for absolute catastrophe. If Reddick succeeded in diverting Willow Creek through his mining operation as planned, the dramatic change in surface water pressure would destabilize the entire underground system that had remained stable for centuries. The aquifer would collapse catastrophically, causing massive flooding downstream that would destroy not just Lakota fishing grounds, but potentially the town itself and every ranch throughout the valley. Your father discovered this geological connection and understood its significance, Harper said quietly, studying the technical details with growing horror. That's precisely why Reddick ordered his death before official reports could be filed with territorial authorities. Abigail nodded with terrible certainty, examining her father's signature and the date notation less than 1 week before his murder. Peter Hale had identified the natural disaster that Reddick's scheme would trigger, and he'd tried to document it properly, according to territorial survey regulations. That documentation had become his death warrant, signed by a man who viewed geological catastrophe as an acceptable price for personal empire. Now they possessed proof that could stop Reddick's plan entirely and bring him to justice for murder, if they could survive long enough to present it to officials beyond his sphere of corrupting influence. Between the stolen ledger, Harper's water contamination samples, and her father's geological surveys, they could construct a legal case that even bought judges would struggle to dismiss or ignore. The crucial question remained whether any of them would live long enough to see justice served. Outside the schoolhouse, the sound of many horses approached through darkness. With military precision, too many riders moving too purposefully to represent coincidence or routine patrol. Back exit, Tokala said, simply gathering their precious evidence while assessing escape routes with tactical precision. They slipped into the night once more, leaving Willow Springs behind, with the grim knowledge that return would be impossible until Reddick's stranglehold on power was broken completely. But this time, Abigail felt the weight of genuine purpose, rather than mere desperation driving her steps forward into uncertainty. They weren't just running anymore from superior forces. They were carrying the weapons that would ultimately win this war for justice and environmental protection. Quiet Will found Dr. Edwin Harper just after sunrise, his characteristically steady hands trembling so violently he could barely control his horse's reins. The deputy's usual methodical deliberation had been completely replaced by something approaching panic and perspiration. Beaded his weathered forehead despite cool morning air that carried promises of changing weather. Uni said, his voice cracking with the strain of carrying unbearable secrets. I desperately need to speak with you privately. It concerns Peter Hale's death, and I can't carry this burden alone anymore. Harper was tending Henry Pike's wounded arm in the clinic's back room, but something in Quiet Will's desperate manner demanded immediate attention despite other pressing medical concerns. The deputy was known throughout Willow Springs for his methodical approach to every situation, his careful consideration of each word before speaking. Witnessing him this severely rattled was deeply unsettling and suggested crisis of enormous proportions. Henry maintained pressure on that bandage and remained quiet. Harper instructed with professional calm. "We'll come inside immediately before someone observes you here." In the clinic's main room, Quiet Will collapsed heavily into a chair and buried his face in shaking hands that showed the tremor of a man pushed beyond his emotional limits. When he finally looked up, his eyes held the haunted expression of someone carrying unbearable guilt for far too long. "I cannot continue carrying this secret, Doc. Cannot keep pretending I don't know exactly what happened to that surveyor 2 years ago when the truth is burning holes in my conscience." The words fell into the quiet room like stones dropped into perfectly still water, creating expanding ripples of implication that would change everything they thought they understood. Harper felt his pulse accelerate dramatically, but maintained his professionally composed demeanor. "What precisely are you telling me, Will?" "I'm confessing that I personally witnessed Charles Reddick murder Peter Hale with my own eyes. Watched him push that good man off the canyon rim in cold blood, then climb down to verify he was dead. Observed him plant a whiskey bottle beside the body to make it appear like a tragic drunken accident." Harper sank into his own chair as the full implications crashed over him like a collapsing avalanche. Quiet Will was describing premeditated murder witnessed directly by a sworn law enforcement officer who'd participated in covering it up for 2 years out of fear and moral cowardice. "Why didn't you report what you witnessed to proper authorities?" "Report it to whom exactly, Magnus Doyle?" He was standing right there helping arrange the scene to look accidental, following Reddick's specific instructions. And Reddick made it crystal clear what would happen to me personally if I ever spoke up about what I'd seen. Will's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "He promised he'd make it appear I was involved in the killing from the very beginning, transform me into the perfect scapegoat for everything. So you remained silent to protect yourself from retaliation." "I stayed alive through cowardice, yes. But now, Reddick's systematically eliminating loose ends to remove any possible threats to his water diversion scheme. And I know with absolute certainty that I'm next on his list for permanent elimination if I continue keeping quiet about murder." Will pulled a brass surveyor's compass from his pocket, its surface engraved with Peter Hale's initials in precise lettering. "I kept this as evidence of what really happened. Don't know why exactly, maybe I always knew someday I'd need to tell the complete truth." Harper examined the precision instrument with growing understanding, recognizing the quality craftsmanship that professional surveyors required for accurate fieldwork. This belonged to Hale personally. Fell from his leather satchel when Reddick threw him into the canyon like discarded trash. I retrieved it quickly before Magnus could notice and make it disappear along with everything else that contradicted their fabricated story. Will's hands were steadying now that he'd begun the process of unburdening his tortured conscience. "There's more crucial information, Doc. Reddick's been setting explosive charges throughout Owl Canyon's rock face for weeks, preparing to detonate them and permanently divert the entire creek through his mining operation." "When is this destruction supposed to occur?" "Very soon, as quickly as the spring snowmelt weakens the ice sufficiently for safe blasting operations. Could be tomorrow night, could be next week. But he's running critically short of time before the territorial inspector arrives for official water rights hearings that could expose everything." This was the confirmation Harper had been dreading with increasing anxiety. Everything they'd suspected about Reddick's catastrophically destructive plan was absolutely true. And the man was desperate enough to accelerate his timeline, regardless of consequences or collateral damage to innocent people. "Well, you must tell this story immediately to the others, Tokala, Abigail, everyone involved in gathering evidence against Reddick. Your eyewitness testimony could provide the crucial missing link we've been searching for. Could also result in my death before I can testify anywhere that actually matters." But Will was already standing with visible effort resolution gradually hardening in his weathered features, despite obvious terror. "Doesn't matter now. I've been dead inside for 2 years carrying this guilt like poison. Better to die honestly than continue living as a coward who enabled murder." When they reached the abandoned line shack, where the fugitives had established their temporary refuge, Quiet Will's confession created immediate and profound impact throughout the group. Abigail stared at the brass compass that had belonged to her beloved father, tears streaming down her cheeks as she traced the familiar initials with trembling fingers that remembered his gentle hands, teaching her to read maps and understand the land. He always claimed this was his most precious professional tool, she whispered through her grief. More valuable than gold, because a surveyor without his compass was just a man with worthless opinions instead of verified facts. Tokala accepted the instrument with careful reverence, studying its construction with the eye of someone who understood precision craftsmanship and its importance to honest work. This represents powerful evidence. Combined with the financial documents from Reddick's office and the water contamination samples, it might prove sufficient to convince an honest judge of Reddick's guilt. Harper agreed with cautious optimism. But we still need to reach Bismarck alive with our evidence intact, and we must prevent Reddick from destroying Owl Canyon before legal intervention becomes possible. How many explosive charges did you observe during your surveillance? Henry Pike asked Will directly, his voice tight with the strain of contemplating his brother's involvement in mass destruction. 6 deep holes drilled precisely into the North Canyon wall, packed with black powder and sealed with fitted wooden plugs. Fuses are already installed and tested. They require only lighting to trigger simultaneous detonation. The entire rock face will collapse when those charges explode in coordination. The logistics were staggering in their scope and complexity, requiring careful timing and multiple people to execute properly. More significantly, it demonstrated that Reddick was totally committed to his plan, regardless of legal consequences. A man preparing to destroy geological evidence of catastrophic environmental damage wasn't planning to submit peacefully to territorial authority. We have to stop him before he destroys everything, Abigail declared with quiet but absolute determination. 5 people against Reddick's entire operation, plus corrupted law enforcement. Henry shook his head doubtfully. That's not strategy, that's suicide disguised as heroism. 6 people. Quiet Will corrected with firm resolve. I'm completely finished taking Reddick's blood money and following his murderous orders. But their planning session was suddenly interrupted by an unexpected arrival that changed everything they thought they understood about their situation. Ronan Pike appeared in the doorway, but instead of his usual aggressive hostility, his expression showed something that looked remarkably like genuine shame. Blood stained his shirt from wounds Tokala had inflicted, and his characteristic swagger had been replaced by something approaching humility. I need to talk with all of you, he said quietly, his massive hands raised to demonstrate he carried no weapons. About my brother Henry, about what Reddick's really planning to accomplish, and about things that have gone too far for any decent man to ignore. The silence that followed stretched taut as everyone processed this unexpected development. Ronan Pike had been Reddick's primary enforcer for years, the man who'd attempted to kidnap Abigail and terrorized anyone brave enough to oppose the mine owner's expansion. His presence here could represent an elaborate trap, but something fundamental in his demeanor suggested otherwise. Speak your piece, Henry said finally, his own voice thick with complicated emotions at seeing his estranged brother in this condition. Reddick's not just planning to divert Willow Creek through his operation. Ronan began each word seeming to cause him physical pain. He intends to collapse the entire mine into the creek bed, creating a permanent dam that will flood this entire valley. The water backup will destroy every ranch, every homestead, every living thing for miles in every direction. The revelation hit the group like a physical blow, stealing breath and hope simultaneously. This wasn't merely about water rights or mining profits. It represented genocide disguised as business development, the deliberate destruction of an entire community for one man's vision of absolute power. Numb. How many innocent people would die in such flooding? Abigail asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hundreds immediately, when the artificial dam creates massive flooding. Thousands more when that improvised structure eventually fails from water pressure and sends a wall of destruction downstream. Ronan's voice broke with genuine emotion. I hired on to intimidate people and break a few heads when necessary. I never signed up for mass murder of entire families. Why should we trust you now after everything you've done? Tokala asked with reasonable skepticism. Because he's still my brother. Henry answered simply. And because some moral lines shouldn't be crossed by any man who wants to continue living with himself. Looking directly at Ronan Pike's face and seeing genuine remorse where arrogance had always been before Abigail made a decision that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. What do you know about Reddick's specific timeline for this destruction? Charges detonate tomorrow night during the new moon when darkness will provide maximum cover. He's positioned Bear Claw and 3 other men to light fuses simultaneously while he observes from the railroad trestle for personal safety and perfect viewing. Now they possessed inside information about Reddick's plan. But they also had less than 24 hours to prevent an environmental and humanitarian disaster that would destroy everything her father had died trying to protect. The final battle was approaching with terrifying inevitability, and this time justice would be determined by unlikely allies united by shared humanity rather than personal advancement or tribal loyalty. But first they had to survive what was coming. The approach to Owl Canyon required crossing 10 miles of increasingly treacherous terrain as storm clouds built overhead like a malevolent ceiling that promised to unleash nature's fury at the worst possible moment. Tokala led their expanded group along paths that barely qualified as trails following ancient game tracks and seasonal creek beds that provided concealment but slowed their urgent progress to a frustrating crawl. Abigail's mare was breathing hard by the time they reached the ridge overlooking the canyon foam showing around the bit, despite cool air that carried the metallic scent of approaching thunder. Below them, Willow Creek carved its timeless path through red sandstone walls sculpted by centuries of patient water, now running high and fast with snowmelt that would become a devastating torrent when the storm finally broke. There, Tokala pointed to obviously scarred rock faces along the north wall, where drilling equipment had left unmistakable marks of recent human activity. 6 charges positioned exactly as Will described. Reddick's guards are already in their final positions. She could see them now. 4 armed men stationed at strategic intervals along the canyon rim. Rifles held with deceptive casualness, but ready for immediate deadly use. They wore the rough clothing of ordinary mine workers, but their alertness and tactical positioning marked them as something far more dangerous than simple laborers earning honest wages. How do we reach those explosive charges without getting shot full of holes? Henry Pike asked with characteristic bluntness. We create multiple simultaneous distractions. Ronan replied, studying the defensive layout with professional interest, born of years planning violent operations. I know their positions, timing, and individual weaknesses. If we coordinate our attacks properly, the plan that emerged was audaciously complex and terrifyingly dependent on precise timing under combat conditions. They would approach from 3 different directions, simultaneously Tokala and Abigail from the blind spot created by natural rock outcroppings, Henry and Quiet Will from the main trail, as an obvious diversion to draw attention, while Ronan used his insider knowledge to eliminate guards who still trusted him enough to allow close approach. What about Bear Claw? Abigail asked, checking her father's pistol with hands that remained remarkably steady, despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. Leave him to me personally, Ronan said with grim finality. We have unfinished business that doesn't involve anyone else in this group. They separated as the first fat raindrops began to fall, with increasing frequency, each pair moving toward their assigned positions while thunder rumbled overhead, with growing intensity that promised nature's own violence to accompany human conflict. Abigail found herself following Tokala across treacherous terrain in near total darkness, trusting his intimate knowledge of this land to guide them safely through obstacles that could cripple or kill. The first guard died quietly when Ronan appeared from familiar shadows with a friendly greeting that transformed instantly into a knife thrust between ribs. The man had worked for Reddick's money, but harbored no personal loyalty, and Ronan's betrayal caught him completely unprepared for sudden death. One enemy eliminated without raising alarm or alerting other defenders. Tokala's assigned target proved more challenging when the guard turned at an unexpected sound, forcing a brief but savage struggle that nearly sent both men over the canyon edge to join the churning waters far below. Only Tokala's desperate grip on a twisted root kept them from following the guard's body into the abyss. But the violent noise had alerted remaining defenders to their presence. Jake, the third guard, called toward his dead companion's position with growing suspicion. "You hearing something down there that needs attention?" That's when the spring storm chose to unleash its full accumulated fury with biblical intensity. Rain began falling in torrents that transformed the canyon into a thundering waterfall, masking sounds and reducing visibility to mere yards, while lightning split the sky with strobing brilliance that created surreal snapshots of violence and desperation. Abigail found herself crouched behind a weathered boulder with Tokala's spare knife gripped in trembling hands, watching the remaining guard methodically search for intruders among the rocks. Her father had taught her marksmanship with patient dedication, but knife work was intimate and final in ways that left no room for hesitation, mercy, or second chances. When the guard stepped around their concealment, she was ready despite terror that threatened to paralyze her completely. The blade went in cleanly under his ribs, angled upward toward the heart exactly as Tokala had demonstrated during their brief training. The man's eyes widened with surprise and pain. But he died before he could cry out or alert the remaining defenders. "I've killed a man with my own hands," she whispered, staring at blood that looked black in the lightning-illuminated darkness. "Do you stop a killer from murdering innocent people?" Tokala corrected with gentle firmness. "Remember that distinction when guilt comes to haunt your dreams." The explosive charges themselves represented professional demolition work, 6 holes drilled with mathematical precision into the canyon wall, packed with black powder and sealed with wooden plugs that fit like precision instruments. Fuses ran from each charge to a central detonation point where they could be lit simultaneously for maximum destructive coordination. "Can we safely remove the powder charges?" Abigail asked, studying the installation with growing dread. Tokala examined the fitted plugs, testing their resistance to removal. "Not without proper tools and considerably more time than we possess. But the fuses can be severed completely." He drew his knife and began cutting the braided cord that would carry ignition to the explosives. Without fuses, the powder becomes completely harmless. They'd severed 4 of the 6 crucial connections when hoofbeats echoed from the trail below, accompanied by voices that carried clearly despite the storm's increasing noise. Reddick was arriving with his detonation crew earlier than expected and in significantly larger numbers than their intelligence had suggested. "Time to abandon this position," Tokala said urgently, gathering their weapons while assessing escape routes under deteriorating conditions. But as they prepared to retreat with their sabotage incomplete, Abigail spotted something that made her heart sink with despair and growing understanding of Reddick's thorough preparation. Hidden among the rocks and leading to the same charges from a completely different approach, she discovered a second complete set of fuses backup systems that Reddick had installed specifically to prevent the kind of interference they'd just attempted. "There's redundancy built into the entire system," she reported with growing dread. "Then we make our final stand here and prevent them from lighting either set of fuses." The makeshift defensive position they constructed from loose stones wouldn't withstand determined assault for long, but it commanded the only practical approach to the remaining charges. If Reddick wanted to complete his catastrophically destructive plan, his men would have to advance directly through concentrated defensive fire. Charles Reddick appeared at the head of a column that included several heavily armed men, but conspicuously absent were Sheriff Magnus and the usual complement of corrupt deputies. The mine owner looked more like a successful businessman than a mass murderer in his expensive black coat and polished boots, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone long accustomed to removing human obstacles without moral consideration. "Miss Hale," he called across the rocky ground between them, his cultured voice carrying clearly despite wind and rain. "I believe we have extremely urgent matters to discuss before this regrettable situation deteriorates any further." "Nothing to discuss with a cold-blooded murderer," she called back, checking her ammunition supply with practiced efficiency. 6 rounds remaining in her father's Colt, plus whatever bullets Tokala carried for his rifle. Against superior numbers, but from a naturally strong defensive position. Your father was an idealistic fool who failed to understand progress when he encountered it. His death was regrettable, but absolutely necessary for the greater good. Reddick gestured to his men, who began spreading out to flank their position with obvious military precision. "You can end this easily by surrendering those stolen documents and walking away. Or you can die here in the mud like he did. The choice remains entirely yours to make." But instead of immediate attack, Reddick tried a different approach, psychological warfare, designed to break her will before risking his men in direct assault. "Do you really think your father's death meant anything?" he continued with calculated cruelty. One naive surveyor against the forces of progress and civilization. He was nothing but an obstacle to be removed, just like you are now. His precious maps couldn't save him, and they won't save you either. Abigail felt rage building in her chest like a physical fire. But she also felt something else, her father's steady presence, his patient lessons about standing up to bullies regardless of their power or position. Peter Hale might be dead, but his principles lived on in his daughter's choices. "My father was worth 10 of you," she shouted back. "At least he built things instead of destroying them." The first exchange of gunfire shattered the canyon's relative quiet like breaking glass bullets, sparking off stone and whining into empty air as both sides sought better positions among the scattered boulders. Abigail discovered that shooting at men who returned fire was vastly different from target practice. Her hands shook, her breathing came in gasps, and accuracy became nearly impossible under life-threatening stress. Tokala remained steadier his rifle, speaking with methodical precision that reflected years hunting dangerous game under pressure. She watched him drop one of Reddick's hired guns with a shot that spun the man around and sent him tumbling into a deep crevice between rocks. The odds remained impossible, but at least they were making the enemy pay for every advance. "The backup fuses." Reddick screamed to his remaining men over the gunfire. "Forget about them, just light those charges immediately before this storm gets any worse." One of his men broke from cover in a desperate sprint toward the secondary detonation point, moving with the speed of someone who knew his life depended on completing this mission. Abigail tracked him with her pistol leading the target, as her father had taught her through patient repetition, and squeezed the trigger with desperate precision. The man stumbled, but kept running, blood showing on his leg where her bullet had found flesh. Then Tokala was moving too, abandoning their defensive position to intercept the runner before he could reach the fuses and complete Reddick's apocalyptic plan. The two men collided among the rocks in a tangle of knives and desperate fury, rolling dangerously close to the canyon edge, while lightning illuminated their life and death struggle in stark detail. But the storm was intensifying beyond anyone's expectations, transforming from spring weather into something approaching natural catastrophe. The torrential rain was sending flash flood waters racing down the canyon with the devastating force of nature completely unleashed, making Reddick's careful timing irrelevant as raw power reshaped the landscape. Too late. Someone screamed over the increasing noise. Waters reached the powder, the charges are completely flooded and useless. Reddick's elaborate scheme was literally washing away in muddy destruction, as his dream of controlling the valley's water supply dissolved into chaos and failure. But instead of accepting defeat gracefully, the mine owner drew his concealed derringer with the desperate fury of a man watching his empire crumble. "If I can't control this canyon, then nobody will," he snarled, aiming the small weapon directly at Abigail with hands that shook with rage and frustrated ambition. "Your father should have minded his own business, and now you'll join him in death." The shot that ended Charles Reddick's life came from Takala's rifle fired from his position among the rocks where he'd been fighting to prevent the detonation. Reddick spun and fell hard, the derringer spinning away across wet stone, as justice finally found him after years of corruption and murder. As the mine owner lay dying with rain washing blood from his wounds, he tried to speak one final time with obvious desperation. "The mine!" He gasped, red foam bubbling at his lips as life ebbed away. Check. The mine. Before, then he was gone, taking whatever final secret he'd wanted to reveal to whatever judgment awaited souls stained with innocent blood. His death marked the end of a reign of terror that had poisoned this beautiful valley for far too long. The storm continued with unabated fury, but now it seemed like nature's way of cleansing the corruption from Owl Canyon and restoring the natural order that Reddick had tried to pervert for personal gain. Lightning split the sky one final time before the rain began to diminish, leaving behind air that smelled clean and fresh with the promise of new beginnings. Justice, it seemed, sometimes required a thunderstorm to wash away the lies. The aftermath of that violent night revealed damage that would require months to repair completely, but also created opportunities for genuine healing that hadn't existed while Charles Reddick lived and schemed with impunity. Sheriff Magnus Doyle, faced with overwhelming evidence of conspiracy, and the detailed testimony of multiple witnesses, placed his tarnished badge on Nora Keene's desk without speaking a word and walked away into uncertain exile and whatever redemption he might find. Judge Robert Sinclair arrived from Bismarck 2 days ahead of schedule, summoned by urgent messages that Quiet Will had managed to send through reliable back channels before the final confrontation at Owl Canyon. The territorial inspector was a man of unquestioned integrity, who'd built his distinguished reputation on fair dealing with both white settlers and native peoples, making him exactly the kind of official Reddick had worked desperately to avoid facing. The comprehensive scope of this corruption is absolutely staggering, Sinclair announced after reviewing all the evidence they'd assembled through such dangerous effort. Water rights fraud, systematic environmental destruction, bribery of law enforcement officials, and premeditated murder. Charles Reddick built his empire on crimes that would have destroyed this entire valley and everyone living in it. The formal hearings that followed were swift but thorough in their examination of every detail. Magnus Doyle pled guilty to multiple conspiracy charges in exchange for complete testimony about Reddick's extensive network of corruption throughout the territory. Bearclaw had found justice at the bottom of Owl Canyon, but his crimes died with him in those churning depths. Quiet Will faced serious charges for his complicity in covering up Peter Hale's murder, but his crucial cooperation earned judicial consideration for significantly reduced sentencing. Most importantly, Professor Williams' detailed analysis of Dr. Harper's carefully collected water samples confirmed everything they'd suspected about mining contamination with scientific precision that couldn't be disputed. Mercury, arsenic, and cyanide compounds had been systematically poisoning the watershed for months, killing livestock and threatening human health throughout the entire region. Reddick's mining operation will be permanently closed, effective immediately. Judge Sinclair declared with the authority of territorial law. All his assets will be seized and sold to fund comprehensive environmental restoration and provide fair compensation to affected families. It cannot undo the harm that's already been done, but it represents a beginning toward genuine healing. During these legal proceedings, Nora Keene made a discovery that would ensure Peter Hale's vision of cooperation survived his tragic death. Among the surveyor's carefully preserved effects filed with the Territorial Land Office, but mysteriously misfiled until this crucial moment, was a water rights certificate that changed everything about the valley's future development. Your father registered the underground aquifer system as a permanent community resource. Sinclair explained to Abigail, showing her the official document that bore territorial seals and her father's distinctive signature. Joint stewardship between the local Lakota band and the town of Willow Springs, with you designated as legal trustee, representing both communities' interests. The certificate was legally unassailable under existing territorial law. Representing more than mere legal protection, it embodied Peter Hale's vision of genuine cooperation between white settlers and native peoples working together to protect shared resources. This was the vision that Reddick had tried to destroy through explosives, corruption, and murder. He knew somehow that this confrontation would come. Abigail realized with growing understanding, studying the document's precise date. He saw what Reddick was planning and prepared legal protection for everyone involved. Your father understood that water belongs to all who need it for survival. Takala agreed with quiet respect. Not just those with sufficient power to steal it through violence or legal manipulation. The revelation transformed their entire situation from desperate defense to legitimate authority. Instead of being victims fighting for basic survival, they were now legal guardians of the very resource Reddick had died trying to control completely. The aquifer, the creek, the fishing grounds, the grazing rights, all of it would be managed cooperatively according to Peter Hale's carefully crafted legal framework. Spring arrived early in Willow Springs that year, bringing new growth and genuine hope for the first time anyone could remember. The poisoned mine was sealed properly to prevent further contamination. Cleanup crews began the patient work of restoring the creek's natural flow, and the town prepared to grow honestly instead of through exploitation and environmental destruction. In the Lakota camp, preparations began for a wedding ceremony that would unite not just two individuals, but two entire communities in shared purpose and mutual respect that transcended racial boundaries. The tribal elders, led by Grey Wolf, had voted unanimously to accept Abigail as a daughter of the band, formally recognizing her courage in battle and her unwavering commitment to protecting their sacred places. The ceremony itself took place on the first genuinely warm day in May, when wildflowers carpeted the prairie in brilliant colors, and Willow Creek ran crystal clear through the canyon that Reddick had tried to destroy for personal profit. Abigail wore her mother's carefully preserved dress, skillfully altered by Nora Keene for frontier practicality, while Takala's wedding clothes reflected both cultural traditions with dignity and pride that honored his ancestors. Dr. Harper provided the legal documentation required by territorial law, while Lakota elders offered traditional blessings for fertility protection and wisdom that would guide their future together. Even Ronan Pike attended the celebration, his relationship with his brother Henry slowly healing through shared acknowledgement of past mistakes and commitment to better choices. In the tradition of our people, Grey Wolf intoned with ceremonial solemnity, marriage creates new possibilities for the entire community. This woman has proven herself worthy through courage, sacrifice, and wisdom. This man has shown honor in protecting those who desperately needed protection. They shared food from common bowls, venison stew seasoned with wild herbs gathered from the hillsides, cornbread baked in Dutch ovens, spring greens that would flourish now that mining contamination was ending forever. The meal was simple by Eastern standards, but it represented abundance and hope after lean winter months when starvation had seemed possible. As evening approached and celebration continued around multiple fires burning bright against the prairie darkness, Abigail found herself walking the creek bank with her new husband, listening to the eternal sound of clean water flowing over stones that would never again carry poison toward the distant Missouri basin. Are you ready for this new life we're creating together? Tokala asked, gesturing toward the teepee that had been prepared for them with symbols of water and earth, painted carefully on buffalo hide walls. Ready for what exactly, marriage between us or building something entirely different between our peoples? Both challenges require identical virtues: patience, courage, and absolute commitment to truth above personal convenience or temporary safety. They'd learned to trust each other through shared hardship and demonstrated mutual respect, which provided stronger foundation than mere passion for the kind of partnership that frontier life demanded from its survivors. Romance might develop naturally over time as they grew together. But reliability, honesty, and understanding were more crucial for both survival and genuine happiness. Inside their wedding teepee, away from celebration's joyful noise, they talked quietly about practical matters that would shape their shared future: where to build their permanent home, how to manage the survey work that territorial law now required for water rights protection, what crops to plant in soil that would be truly clean again. Later, as they lay close together, listening to the night sounds of the camp horses shifting in the remuda, the distant call of coyotes, soft conversations around dying fires, Abigail felt something she'd almost forgotten was possible in her dangerous world: complete peace of mind and heart. Not the peace of absolute safety, because the frontier would never be entirely safe for anyone, regardless of legal protections. Not the peace of perfect certainty, because their future would inevitably hold challenges they couldn't yet imagine or prepare for completely. But the peace of genuine belonging, of having found her true place in the world, beside someone who understood both her strengths and her vulnerabilities without judgment. Outside their teepee, the Dakota wind carried scents of growing things and promises of summer abundance that would heal the land's wounds. Willow Creek sang its ancient song as it flowed toward the Missouri, carrying life instead of death to the great river systems that connected their small valley to the wider world beyond. In the morning, there would be important work to do: surveys to complete with scientific precision, water rights to document properly for legal protection, a genuinely cooperative community to build from the ashes of Reddick's greed and systematic corruption. There would be inevitable conflicts between old ways and new necessities, the constant challenges of frontier life against an unforgiving landscape that tested human resolve daily. But tonight, there was simply this perfect moment: two people who'd found each other in violence and chaos, emerging with something precious worth defending for the rest of their lives together. Love might grow between them naturally as seasons changed, or it might remain the deep partnership they'd already forged through shared trials by fire. Either possibility would be enough for happiness. The creek ran clear under infinite prairie stars, carrying no poison. Now only the promise of tomorrow, and all the tomorrows that would follow in endless succession. Peter Hale's dream of justice lived on in the water's eternal song, in his daughter's hard-won courage, and in the cooperation between peoples that would heal wounds corruption had carved deep into this beautiful, unforgiving land.